So general motivation. If I start speeding, stop me. I do that out of nervousness. So Professor Sàágua has this challenge for me that if my suggestion of a situated approach to emotions is going to work at all, then I have to somehow account for the normative force of emotions. And so this comes out of this kind challenge that he has done to me. And I basically write stuff, send him stuff, and he goes like, no, not yet. But we've already written something together, so progress, I think. Okay. One of the reasons why I fail has to do with I tend to see lots of complexity. So when I first started doing the approach to emotions in the situated approach, I used to call it a theory. I'm much better now because I call it just an approach. There is no theory. So, and the idea is that whatever comes out of this can be used for other theoretical approaches too. Right. Okay. So the collaboration tries to account for this, I think, a problem that emotions have this sort of ambivalent status, right? So Peter Goldie puts it really nicely when he says, quote, "We are inclined to say that emotional experience can sometimes tell us things about the world that reason alone will miss." End of quote. But it's also the case that we are inclined to say that our emotions can and do profoundly distort our view of things. And he gives the examples of anger and jealousy. Okay. So, outline. So first I'm going to say a little bit about emotion and rationality, then how is it that meta-emotions are regulative mechanisms of emotional processes, and then I'm going to try to deal with this thing that I call emotional complexity. That basically, I've been having this idea ever since Cecilia asked at the first date for somebody to draw a diagram. I have a diagram, I can't believe it. Okay, and so actually the take is that instead of seeing emotions like this, then we actually see that they are layered. And then you get different types of issues. And actually, I even see a different dimension that doesn't appear today, but I see depth too. Okay. That's my diagram. Where's Kelly? Oh, I made it. Okay, right. And then I'm going to talk about, actually it's the other way around, I'm sorry. First I'm going to talk about the situated approach to emotions, then about emotions as causes and reasons. Okay, and then I'm going to talk about future directions, because what happens is I find that the only true test, I have another pragmatist here, so I feel a bit more in company. The true test of a proposal is to see how pregnant it is, that is, what sort of theoretical consequences one can take from it, and further work that one can do. All right. I try to do as much as possible so I don't get nervous. Oh my God, it's not really working. So, has become more and more visible that our conception of rationality falls short if we do not include how feelings, emotions, and sentiments make part of rationality. However, it remains to be shown how our conception of rationality incorporates and requires this emotional input, for we cannot simply add emotions to our notion of rationality. In fact, the way in which we can still find in the current literature the opposition of emotion to rationality, sometimes it's actually subtle, means that the integration of emotions into rationality is still being processed. And ultimately, there'll need to be an explanation for the long historical legacy of thinking of emotions as opposed to reasons. So, somehow accommodate that they were not just insane, there was some reasonableness to their thinking. So, I'm sorry, I'm repeating. Okay. So one of the strategies to conceptualize rationality in light of the overwhelming research upon the nature of emotion is by identifying the complexity of the issue and translating it in useful ways for future research. So researchers capture the way emotions are complex, multidimensional, and multi-layered. So I was really pleased to hear Tom talk about, about meta-emotions, because okay. So namely by identifying and understanding the function of meta-emotions in emotional life. Okay, so when emotions are about emotions, they're layered instead of sequential. So for example, when someone is sad about their shame, their sadness is a meta-emotion. And though the existence of meta-emotion is undeniable, attention to the phenomenon of meta-emotion has only recently been the focus of philosophers and psychologists. And there are many questions, right? So when do they appear? These are just examples, there's more. Can all emotions exist at this second order level? then there's a matter of vocabulary, because the first time it actually appears in psychological literature is as a secondary emotion, but then they mix it with other stuff. Anyway, and how can we identify them? Right. I'm not going to answer those questions. I'm just saying I'm aware that there's all these problems. Okay. So previous work has shown that meta-emotions cannot be handled as a simple an example of emotion, right? Because reflexivity modifies the nature of our emotional world. It does this for two reasons. First, because meta-emotions necessarily have an impact on the value of the first-order emotion. This means that when we feel a meta-emotion, its object, the first-order emotion, changes, and it also changes the emotional experience. That is, it is a completely different emotional scenario to say that someone was sad than to say that they were embarrassed that they were sad, or to say that someone was angry that they were sad. And second, because the description of experience, which includes the meta-emotional level, may end up being surprising and revealing of both the subject who experiences and the event of the person experiencing. So giving a mirror of this Janus-faced nature of emotions that de Souza identifies. Okay. So the information with the description of meta-emotion is not simply a matter of having more information about the experience. The extra knowledge we get from meta-emotions may change the meaning of the experience altogether. Okay. I'm so glad I have also a Dewey scholar here who knows that this is Dewey would be so happy. Okay. So meta-emotions have shown to be important in considering regulation of emotion because, I quote, perceiving an emotion as problematic, aversive, or unacceptable instead of normal, comprehensible, and acceptable can influence the way a person regulates the emotional state. And consequently, meta-emotions are also a decisive part of self-appraisal. So both philosophers and psychologists identify meta-emotions as human mechanisms to establish a healthy emotional regulation. Okay. Oh, I'm speeding. So emotion regulation is also even though it appeared in 1982, more recently has been developed. So it appeared in developmental psychology, and many researchers consider emotion regulation as central to psychopathology. Emotion regulation appears as distinct from emotion generation because the first refers to ways in which people influence quote, which emotions they have, when to have them, and to experience them, and how to express them, end of quote. While emotion generation concerns what triggers the emotion to appear. And according to some perspectives, the distinction exists on the assumption that the two are biologically distinct. But this is, it's debatable, and it's not a set matter. Okay. So while anger will be generated by an unfair situation, the regulation refers to all the types of processes the person can experience to deal with the anger already in place in face of an unfair situation, like controlling expression of anger, re-evaluating the situation to verify its unfairness, avoid future instances of confronting with aspects of the unfair situation already in process. Okay, so it's... So, according to Gross, emotion can be regulated at 5 points in the emotion generative process: selection of the situation, modification of the situation, and deployment of attention, change of cognitions, and modulation of responses. And this means that the therapeutic interventions to help individuals, couples, families to modify ineffective patterns of emotional regulations are the staple of psychotherapy. And it targets the ways to influence situations and way to modify the way the situation is construed, in addition to search for ways to alter the emotional response to the situation itself. Okay. However, it's also the case that meta-emotions might produce vicious circles and rebound effects, right? And therefore provide information on regulatory processes operating on the target emotion. So, for example, being angry about one's anxiety will influence the experience of that anxiety. And this process differs from experiencing compassion about being anxious. And ultimately, not only exerting a powerful influence on well-being. So the story is a little bit more complicated, and this is Howard. It's a really nice paper on meta-emotions. In spite of their reputation for being tools of emotional self-regulation, meta-emotions are also prime contributors to the mess inside us. And I'm going to show how he describes this mess. So Howard shows in Meta-Emotional Intentionality that it can be the case that, I quote, iterated intentional turnabouts can rapidly lead to meta-emotional pileups. So situations in which one's emotions about one's emotions have become so self-devouring and clogged with rationalization that their intentional and rational structure is impossible to untangle, end of quote. That is, recognizing meta-emotions as strategies for healthy emotion regulation also means accepting that there is no trait in reflexivity that guarantees the adaptive and healthy outcome. So given the relationship between emotions and meta-emotions, it can be far more complex and negative than the usual positive regulative connections. Actually, Howard, he points out that most of the literature actually talks about this positive take, and it's shortcoming, so I want to emphasize because I think he's so right. Anyway, it's crucial to identify the ways in which regulation can be maladaptive. Okay. So even though, so I think Howard's right, reflexivity does not necessarily come with a positive self-corrective direction, but just like thinking about thinking does not. But it's a privileged ground for instances of regulatory mechanisms, because just as thinking about thinking can guide and correct thinking, so emotions about emotions can refine and correct feeling. Okay. But Howard thinks there's another difficulty with meta-emotions, which I'm going to take up so that I can put in the situated approach to emotions. He thinks that one of the things that happens is when you look at meta-emotions, you see that the the theories that we have available are not sufficient to deal with meta-emotion cases. He says they're sufficient in some instances, but in others they are not. Right? So I was especially pleased about this because I actually think that no theory of emotion is complete without dealing with this issue. And I'm not even going to reflect if he's right on his evaluation, but just to say that he has the same evaluation about it. Okay, so he argues that we tend to think about emotions intentionally as, I quote, mediated by a separate state that represents the object such as perception or belief, end of quote, and cannot be applied and transferred to many emotions, right? So he calls it this, he calls it a tripartite, I can't, tripartite model, and he says, when you look at meta-emotions, you can see that some meta-emotions cannot qualify it, and, I should read. So the tripartite is the view that the relation of emotions to its object is mediated by another mental state, such as a belief, perception, memory, or imagining, that represents the object in question. As to explain that the intentionality of emotions and the cognitive basis of emotions are the ways in which it can be explained that the object of an emotion is something that we are aware of by way of other states. Right? And so Howard writes that the simplest and most direct episodes of meta-emotions turn out to undermine the tripartite model as a thesis about the necessary structure of emotional intentionality. And he even says that, oops, okay, this is just an example, sorry. So he illustrates this with hating his own jealous thoughts. He writes, I quote, when we recognize that a typical target of a meta-emotion is an emotional experience, that what I load are the jealous thoughts and feelings I'm experiencing, it becomes clear that two-part analysis is sufficient, so you don't need a mediated state, is sufficient to account for meta-emotional intentionality. For it is the nature of having jealous thoughts and feelings that one is ordinarily aware of. And if my jealous core experience is already characterized by such a self-awareness, then it does not stand in need of a further representation, if it is to be the target of another mental attitude, such as a meta-emotion. Okay, but then he thinks that this actually shows that there's other shortcomings for the tripartite model. So when we compare it with other instances of emotions about other states, such as a sensation, like I'm embarrassed about my pain, in which there is no need for a third mental state mediating, revealing that there's even deeper problem with the tripartite model. I'm not going to analyze if he's right or not, but I'm going to assume that there's something truth about this, and I'm going to say that, well, maybe if we look at meta-emotions with a situated approach, then maybe we can overcome this. Okay, so for emotion theory, the situated approach to emotions is a very specific advantage. So given that the domain of emotion leave emotion theorists with no viable alternative to theoretical pluralism, for the time being at least, and that the situated approach to emotions can be done within a plural theoretical background, and consequently that means that the situatedness perspective is not in principle incompatible with other existing theoretical approaches. Okay. So the philosophical efforts to provide a situated approach to emotions have been on the rise in the last years, and most of this philosophical work is done within a situated approach to the mind and influenced by important psychologists and biologists. But it's also possible to identify philosophical antecedents of the situated cognition, of which John Dewey is one of the people. The other persons are Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger. Okay. So our specific take on the situated approach to emotion is developed upon John Dewey's philosophical work. And as Gallagher writes, Dewey is not just part of the historical background of the situated perspective upon the mind, but we can learn by thinking further about his contributions. I'm totally with Roberta on this. Okay. Namely, when we read Dewey, quote, we should add the important point that the situation should be defined as inclusive of the inquirer. It is not I, as a cognitive inquirer, confronting a situation, so the situation is not external to the subject, the situation surrounds and includes me, end of quote. Thus, recovering Dewey's description and what is a situation enables us to move away from the colloquial use that takes situation to be independent of the subject of experience, and able to adopt a philosophical technical meaning that incorporates the subject of experience into the notion of situation. Okay. Oops. So when we extend this insight of emotion theory and build upon Dewey's crucial notion of situation, taking up the way Dewey explains that, quote, an emotion is to and from or about something objective, an emotion is implicated in a situation. Right? So but in order to do this, we have to take on the objection that usually Dewey is confronted with, which is this description of situation in which the subject is included leaves always the question, who's the subject of experience? So, for example, the notion of problematic situation, which is the notion that Dewey deals mostly, requires that a subject has had an experience and identified it as its problematic character. And so it raises the question, would the situation still be problematic without the subject to disclose it? And so if we answer yes, we're forced to wonder why Dewey chooses such terminology, for the word problematic implies someone to find it such. However, if we answer no, the problematic character of the situation is dependent on the subject, and therefore will vary according to the different subjects who experiences. And this, in addition, means that we can argue that then the problematic character of situation will greatly depend on the abilities of the subject to identify problems. So for Dewey, the objection lies in confusing the importance of the subject in experience without bias towards objectivity. He writes, quote, experience shows that a matter of fact, objective reference precedes subjective reference. Reference to a subject instead of an object is intrinsic and reflective. It is indeed only another mode of objective reference. That is, some tediousness of the object is accounted for in terms of an unusual state of the object. Otherwise, to say I am bored and it is tedious are merely two phrases to express exactly the same fact. Thus, we assume that when a situation is of a certain kind, it affects the subject who experiences accordingly. If the situation is confusing, the subject feels puzzled and confused. And if the situation is dangerous, then the subject feels fear. In fact, it is this that explains that we think something is wrong when, for some reason, the subject does not have a certain disposition in a given situation. So, for instance, when a scary situation does not frighten the subject of the situation. My God, I'm getting so tired of saying situation. Right. And Dewey adds, asking the question whose experience carries another implication, namely that the nature of ownership is such that the rational discourse about what is owned is unattainable, and that the fact that something is mine, yours, or hers so permeates the properties of being a house that nothing intelligibly can be said about the later. And of course he wants to deny this. Okay. So in addition, the theoretical Deweyan background raises the possibility of equating emotions with the notion of situation while taking moods to be explored by the notion of context. Though I'm not going to elaborate on this, I just want to point out that this is, again, that is, given that we already think of emotions as being given with an overall mood, we can redefine the description by thinking that this happens similarly to the way a situation is given within a context. This would show the interesting connection of both emotions and moods to the environment and explain their difference. And at the same time, the hypothesis that emotions are best understood by the notion of situation, while moods by the notion of context, would provide an interpretive tool to equate their interconnection by understanding the links between context and situation. So, emotions and meta-emotions, to be fully understood, require an accurate description of the situation in which they occur or that they qualify. So, for example, if someone acts out of fear of water when one is 3 years old, we may not require more than a description of fear of the ocean. So this description of horizontality of emotions might be, totally okay to deal with the fact. But we easily take fear as something that happens to that person. We easily take fear as something that happens to that person. But if someone acts out of fear of water when one is 30, 40, 50, and I have to sort of put a big bracket, we may feel curious at what story lies behind this reaction, for we look to read the description of the situation as incomplete. And our suggestion is that the normative force of emotion is the key for understanding the complete description of the situation at stake. All right. So, when someone is at the mercy of their fear, fear works in a determinate causal form. Okay. However, when someone is embarrassed about their fear and controls embarrassment, it seems to be better grasped by the description of being a reason to keep up acting towards a certain goal despite the fear. So the reflexivity grants an added ability of control and regulation of emotions, and being able to identify meta-emotions and their regulatory role also enables to better grasp how emotions work as reasons. But it is possible to imagine that someone is embarrassed even before the fearful event. And in this case, embarrassment no longer is best captured as a reason and can also be described, I didn't put that, but it can also be described as a cause, right? So this means that describing a situation means, oh my goodness. Describing not simply the way that meta-emotions color and influence first-order emotions, but that the description of the situation needs to grasp when the different emotional levels require different responses. Accordingly, someone who has been taught not to get angry may feel shame and hide anger, because this person will have difficulty in acting, and this person will have difficulty in acting in a strategic and appropriate way that encompasses both emotional states. But second, also, the description of the situation to be complete must identify how certain meta-emotions can become first-order emotions when one predicts the possibility of danger. Consequently, for example, Jones and Bodker argue that becoming aware of our meta-emotions may be a crucial way to change perspective and adopt a more collaborative way to deal with conflict situations. So if our suggestion is correct, it would mean that describing the situation is crucial for working out how emotions and meta-emotions work in reasoning, because, one, to the extent that we get a description, we attain the values that guide and format the description. And two, descriptions may modify the interpretation of a situation and enable regulatory mechanisms following the items identified by Gross. Three, introducing an emotion in a process of reasoning may be what is required to shift the description and provide one that enables other actions. Okay, I think I speeded a bit. Okay, oh no, so good, thanks. Okay, so this is the sense of pregnancy of the proposal. So I see all these possible further developments. So first, this connection seems to give emotion, a possibility to talk about how emotion and language are connected, which of course everybody knows they are connected, but it's so hard to know how. So statements can have a feeling because they may be a way to modify a situation. Right? But on the other hand, a spoken sentence may not really have the feeling it carries. Right. So the fact that you ground it on a situation may provide a way to make this distinction, and show that in some ways, in some moments, a sentence may carry a feeling, but in other moments, the apparently same sentence, which of course is not the same sentence, does not carry the same feeling. Right. It works more like an action. So B, meta-emotion and emotional well-being. So positive regulatory aspects of meta-emotions may be better understood when linked to the interpretation of a situation. So that means that I agree Howard's right. It does not reflexivity does not grant us emotional health, but maybe what happens is when we tie it to the situation properly, when we identify it in a situation properly, it doesn't even have to be in a representational way, then we can see how is it that sometimes it works in a positive way and other times it doesn't work in a positive way. Okay. So C, feelings of thought. So a thought may have a feeling to the extent that it carries a situation and modifies a situation. And this implies that even ideas can do that. Okay. D, connection between normative and descriptive. Right. So meta-emotions can show that they have an impact in reasoning because they add elements to the situations. And because descriptions are already loaded with meta-emotional. So that means that actually what happens is it's like suggesting that all descriptive statements already have the normative included in them. Right? It's just not visible, but it's there. I think I'm done. Yes. Okay, thank you.